"You're not welcome here anymore," she said, her voice like ice shards against velvet. The music, a carefully curated playlist of sophisticated jazz, seemed to falter for a beat, then resumed its smooth, indifferent flow. Around us, the soft glow of strategically placed lighting illuminated the polished mahogany and the hushed murmurs of our guests. Faces, familiar and important, turned slowly, their smiles faltering as they registered the venom in her pronouncement. It wasn't a question, not a request, but a decree, delivered with a chilling finality that sucked the air from the cavernous living room. My own breath caught, a physical shock rippling through me, a disbelieving tremor that started in my gut and radiated outward. I looked at her, at the haughty tilt of her chin, the carefully painted, unblinking gaze, and for the first time in years, I saw her not as my wife, but as a stranger, a queen in a costume, holding court in home. Our life together had been a tapestry woven with threads of privilege and outward appearances. We lived in a mansion that had been in my family for generations, a place where history whispered from the walls and the scent of old wood and beeswax was a constant perfume. I'd inherited it, along with a comfortable fortune, but it was the life I'd built its walls, a life of quiet routine, of intellectual pursuits, and of a carefully maintained domestic peace that I cherished. She, Clara, had been a whirlwind when we met, a breath of fresh air in my somewhat sheltered existence. Or so I'd thought. The reality, I was slowly coming to understand, was far more suffocating. The pretense of our union had always been a delicate balancing act. She was the social butterfly, the hostess extraordinaire, the one who navigated the shark-infested waters of our circle with a predatory grace. I was the quiet observer, the man who preferred his books and the predictable rhythm of his days to the glittering, hollow exchanges that filled her calendar. The cracks in our foundation had started small, barely noticeable fissures, a dismissive sigh when I discussed a new research paper, a subtle eye roll at my simple tastes, a growing impatience with my introverted nature. She craved admiration, attention, the constant validation of her own perceived superiority. I, on the other hand, simply wanted peace. There was the inheritance from my Aunt Eleanor, a woman I'd been exceptionally close to. Her passing had been a profound loss, and the will reading, conducted in the hushed solemnity of a solicitor's office, was a difficult affair. Clara had been unusually attentive that day, holding my hand, dabbing imaginary tears from her eyes. But later, when the lawyer read out the specific bequests, her grip tightened almost painfully. She'd barely disguised her disappointment when she realized the bulk of Aunt Eleanor's antique jewelry collection, pieces I'd admired since childhood, was left to my sister. That evening, while I was still numb with grief, I'd found her in the dressing room, not mourning, but meticulously cataloging the few pieces of costume jewelry Aunt Eleanor had left to her, comparing them against a jewelry appraisal she'd surreptitiously acquired. The gleam in her eye wasn't sorrow, it was calculation. Then there was the renovation project. I'd wanted to restore the original library, a room filled with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a magnificent fireplace. Clara, however, had envisioned a state-of-the-art home cinema. The architect presented both plans. I'd spoken about the historical significance of the library, the craftsmanship, the quiet sanctuary it represented. Clara had spoken about square footage, resale value, and the obsolescence of traditional libraries in the digital age. Her argument, delivered with practiced persuasive charm, had won the day. I'd watched, a silent spectator, as her contractors, hired without my full consultation, began dismantling the beautiful oak paneling, their saws screaming a death knell for a room that had stood for a century. The final straw wasn't the destruction itself, but the smug satisfaction on her face as she surveyed the sterile, gray shell that replaced it, a hollow monument to her unchecked desires. And there were countless other instances, smaller slights that accumulated like dust bunnies under antique furniture. The way she'd accidentally delete important emails from my inbox that she deemed unimportant, the subtle sabotage of my social plans if they didn't involve her preferred set, the constant passive-aggressive digs about my perceived lack of ambition, all delivered with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. I endured it all, internalizing the frustration, the slow erosion of my self-worth, because I believed in the sanctity of our vows, in the commitment I had made. I told myself it was a phase, a difficult patch, that love and time would smooth the edges. I was wrong. The party was in full swing, the air thick with the sea. Linking of crystal, the murmur of conversation, and the intoxicating scent of expensive perfume. It was a gathering of my family, my oldest friends, people who knew the history of this house, the legacy it represented. Clara, radiant in a shimmering emerald gown, was playing the perfect hostess, her laughter bright and musical, her every gesture designed to impress. I had been circulating, a quiet presence, making sure everyone had what they needed, a role I usually found comforting. Then, she approached me. She didn't take my arm, didn't lean in for a private word. She stood before me, a small, expectant smile playing on her lips, and then she delivered her pronouncement, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Darling," she began, her voice dripping with a sweetness that masked the underlying malice, "I think it's time you took a break. You're looking a bit overwhelmed. Why don't you go upstairs and rest? I can handle everything here." The music seemed to dim, the laughter of our guests a distant, distorted hum. Heads turned. My uncle, a man who had seen me grow up within these walls, frowned, a look of concern creasing his brow. My sister, usually so vivacious, stopped mid-sentence, her eyes wide with surprise. Clara's gaze was fixed on me, a triumphant glint in her eyes. She expected me to comply, to shuffle away like a scolded child, to retreat to the privacy of the upstairs, leaving her to bask in the admiration of our guests. Her audacity was breathtaking. She wasn't just trying to humiliate me, she was trying to erase me from my own party, from my own home. The carefully constructed facade of our marriage crumbled in that instant, revealing the brittle, self-serving core beneath. The humiliation was a cold wave, but beneath it, something else began to stir. A quiet anger, sharp and precise, honed by years of silent endurance. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't give her the satisfaction of a scene. I simply looked at her, my gaze steady, and a slow, almost imperceptible smile touched my lips. "Actually, Clara," I said, my voice calm and even, cutting through the sudden hush, "I think you're the one who needs a break. From telling people what to do in my house." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken history. Clara's smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion, then anger. She opened her mouth to retort, but I continued, my voice gaining a quiet authority that surprised even myself. "You see," I said, my eyes sweeping across the now silent room, taking in the shocked faces of our guests, "I've been reviewing some of our financial arrangements. And it seems there's been a misunderstanding about ownership." I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored jacket and withdrew a sheaf of papers. They were thick, bound with a simple clip, and looked utterly out of place amongst the champagne flutes and canapes. "This," I announced, holding up the top document, "is a revised trust agreement. It outlines the terms under which this property is held. And according to Clause 7b, any significant expenditure or alteration made without the explicit written consent of the primary trustee, that would be me, can be considered a breach of fiduciary duty." I let that sink in, the legal jargon a sharp, unexpected weapon. Clara's face had turned a mottled shade of red, her carefully crafted composure shattering. "And this," I continued, my voice devoid of emotion, "is a notice of default, accompanied by a formal request for arbitration regarding the unauthorized renovations you've undertaken." "Essentially," I said, turning the pages to reveal the signature at the bottom, "mine, you've spent a considerable amount of money on renovations that you don't actually have the legal standing to authorize." The music had stopped completely now. The only sound was the faint crackle of the fireplace and the rapid beating of Clara's heart, which I could almost hear across the silence. Her eyes, usually so confident, darted around the room, searching for an escape, for an ally, but found only the unwavering stares of people who had witnessed her downfall. My mother, who had been standing near the doorway, her face a mask of polite interest, now wore a look of dawning comprehension. She had always suspected Clara's machinations, but had remained on the periphery, respecting my choices. Now, she saw the full extent of it, laid bare for all to witness. Clara stammered, her voice losing its regal timbre. That's ridiculous. You can't just. Oh, but I can, I interrupted, my voice still calm. I flipped to another page, a single sheet with a bold, red stamp. And this, I said, my gaze meeting hers, is a court order. For your immediate eviction from the premises, pending the outcome of the arbitration. It was filed yesterday, and served this morning. I decided to wait until your party to inform you, out of respect for the guests. And for my mother, who, I added, looking at my mother with a small nod, has always been very clear about who belongs in this house, and who simply visits. My mother returned my nod, a flicker of approval in her eyes. Clara looked as if she'd been physically struck. The color drained from her face, leaving her skin a ghastly white. The mask was gone, replaced by raw panic and disbelief. She opened her mouth again, but no sound came out. The party, her carefully orchestrated stage, had become her very public humiliation. The immediate aftermath was a symphony of frantic texts and choked phone calls. Clara, stripped of her authority and her home, became a whirlwind of indignation. Her flying monkeys, the sycophants and gossip mongers she'd cultivated, descended in a flurry of well-intentioned but ultimately useless advice. My sister was distraught, calling me repeatedly, begging me to reconsider, to show mercy. My mother, however, remained a steadfast ally. She'd always disliked Clara's influence, her manipulative nature, and Clara's public unraveling confirmed her worst suspicions. She called me once, not to plead, but to offer quiet support. You did what you had to do, son, she'd said, her voice raspy with emotion. Some people build houses. Others just borrow them. Clara's social standing evaporated like mist. The whispers started subtly, then grew into a cacophony. Her carefully curated friendships dissolved, her invitations ceased. The world she had so desperately tried to conquer, the one she had believed she had a right to command, turned its back on her with swift, almost brutal efficiency. Without the mansion as her gilded cage, without the constant stream of admirers and the illusion of wealth and status, she was simply diminished. The legal proceedings were swift and decisive. The unauthorized renovations were deemed a blatant disregard for the trust agreement, and she was held liable for a significant portion of the costs. Her financial situation, which had been propped up by my resources, imploded. She was forced to sell her designer clothes, her expensive jewelry, the few pieces she had managed to acquire, to cover her immediate debts. The woman who had once held court in my grand halls was reduced to a tenant in a small, nondescript apartment, her every movement now scrutinized by creditors. The silence that followed was profound. The mansion, once a site of tense domesticity, now felt vast and quiet, filled only with the echoes of the past. I walked through its rooms, no longer a reluctant participant in a charade, but its sole custodian. There was no triumph, no surge of vindictive pleasure. Just a quiet, almost mournful sense of finality. The emotional justice had been served, not through shouting or confrontation, but through a cold, precise dismantling of her carefully constructed world. She had underestimated my quiet resolve, my understanding of the legal frameworks that underpinned our shared life, and my willingness to finally act when pushed too far. The house remained a testament to my family's history, and I remained within it, finally free to live my life on my own terms, in the quiet dignity I had always deserved. The music, when I chose to play it now, was the sophisticated jazz she had once favored, but it sounded different. It sounded like peace.